Hello, folks. Welcome to the Genuinely Interested podcast. I'm your host, Roy Bensby. This podcast is an opportunity for me to speak with some of the most interesting people I know, either with amazing talents or achievements, or unbelievable life stories, or just invaluable insights into areas which they have dedicated their lives to studying. I sit down with these amazing individuals from across the planet, and I try to ask them questions that will hopefully help you, the listener, extract something valuable or learn something new or just hopefully get inspired by. You can find all the episodes for the podcast on all the major podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Spotify, Google, Overcast, iHeartRadio, literally all of them. It's there. If you love the show, if it adds value to your life in any way, shape, or form, please leave reviews on iTunes. It really helps grow the podcast. It puts it up there so more people can see it. You can also find all the episodes and everything else, all the information that's updated regularly on the website, which is roybensv.com, ROYBENTZVI.com. And you can sign up for updates as well. I've also been updating the YouTube channel. So I've been uploading all the old episodes pretty much on a daily basis. So you can find it there. And in the future, I hope to make video podcasting as well. If that's something you guys want to check out and are interested in, please shoot me email. I'd love to hear from you. And also make sure to check out the social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter. I post there daily. And lastly, if you guys want to support and help grow the podcast, please go to Buy Me a Coffee or Anchor or Patreon. It is an endeavor to grow this podcast and make it what it should be. And it takes a village. So I want to thank each and every one of you for listening. I see that there are literally listeners from all over the world in each and every country. So thank you to everyone, and on to the show. All right, folks, this week on the podcast, we have Gil Dibner. Gil is a general partner at Angular Ventures. He's been an active venture investor focused on enterprise technology companies since around 2005. And he has backed over 30 companies, some of them like Yetta, SwiftShift, and JFrog. He has a lot of insights into deep tech and generally into investing. This was a really, really great conversation, something that I am personally interested in, being an entrepreneur myself. And he's just a whole encyclopedia of information. So I was glad I could tap into that. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do the full extended episode that I wanted to do, which is, an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. There were some time constraints, so it's a little bit shorter than what we usually do, but still, it is packed with information and really, really great episode. We covered things like why Israel is such a powerhouse in the tech scene, why SaaS companies have made such strides and are so sought after as far as investments, and why Zoom completely took over in 2020. So a lot of fun, a lot of information, a lot of insights. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you're interested in tech, or if you just love to hear a great conversation, I highly suggest you listen to the podcast. So without further ado, here is Gil Dibner. Enjoy the podcast, everyone.
The Genuinely Interested Podcast.
Hey, Gil.
Hey, Roy, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Okay, is it Roy or Roy?
That's a good question. That's something I've been battling with the majority of my life. When I was born, it was Roy, and that's what everyone called me. And then I moved around a lot as a kid, and I lived in South Africa and in Ghana, and I was in American schools, and no one could pronounce it, so I just shortened it to Roy to save the headache of Roy.
Right.
So I've been stuck with Roy ever since.
So I was Gil, and then I moved to Israel, and I became Gil, and then I moved to Europe, and I'm either Gil or Gilles, depending on who I'm talking to.
Yeah. I don't know why Hebrew names are hard to pronounce for foreigners, especially English speakers, I think. So almost any name that you have when you're in Israel and then you go overseas, they'll change it a little bit somehow.
Yeah.
So you have to adjust. All right, so I know you're in London. We spoke a little bit before the podcast, and if you could just give us a little bit of understanding what the emotions are, what it's like in COVID right now over there.
COVID in London. I feel like this is like nothing but political landmines. But I think I think London is, right now it's, what is it, January 14th. Last week, 2 weeks ago, if you'd asked me, all the news here was about the UK variant and the killer mutant strain of the virus, which was apparently detected in the UK and exists everywhere. Apparently, I mean, it's in the US, it's in Israel, it's all over the world. The headline today is there's a Brazilian variant. So the headlines here, like, should the UK shut down flights from Brazil or whatever? I think net, uh, London is actually not that different from any other big city that's been hit by this in the Western world.
Hmm.
Um, we're in the middle of a pretty serious second wave or third wave, depending on how you're counting it. They're vaccinating relatively well. Israel's obviously vaccinating, as of right now. Israel's vaccinating best in the world, followed by UAE and Bahrain, and then London, I think, is next in terms of the percentage and the speed of vaccination.
Israel's like
So
2 million people. It's like 22% of the population or
yeah,
something.
yeah. Israel was 22%. I think UK is like 2 point something percent, which I guess a lot of people. I mean, in a country
Yeah.
this size. I think there's obviously corona fatigue. There's obviously a lot of fear. I think there's obviously, as there is probably everywhere that I'm aware of, there's frustration with some aspects of the government response. But I think, different countries have done different things really well. The British have been the best in the world, apparently, at sequencing. So these variants have been discovered here, but they're not necessarily British variants. They were just discovered here because the UK is sequencing, I think, 10% of the cases that they identify, they actually sequence, which is way higher than anywhere else. And the vaccine here is relatively good rollout. Could be better, but we'll see. I can't wait for this to be over. I miss people.
Oh, dude, it's yeah, there's a cost that I think people maybe don't discuss as much, which is the solitude, which is the social distancing, which is this fear almost to be around people, like not going in the same elevator, not hugging your friends, not being social, not going to the gym, all those things that we kind of took for granted earlier. And now I think people are missing it. But when they tell you to social distance, that's one of those things, I think I saw the other day where both suicide and homicides are on the rise in a lot of countries. And it's just not healthy for us to be. I think that's one of the things we learned this year. It's not healthy to be alone for such extended periods of time. There is a real effect that happens.
It becomes, I think, a deeply philosophical conversation of what is the purpose of life, what is the value of life, and one of the things that I think has been shocking and most depressing to me has been I would say that the quality of debate on the response,
Hmm.
not the nature of the virus. There is a virus. It's a deadly virus. It's killing a lot of people. But the quality of the debate on what the response should be has just been abysmal. There's two polar extremes that live in their own bubbles of either act as if there's no virus, which is completely, utterly irresponsible, or lock everyone up in their house forever and everyone wears masks until there's no COVID left anywhere in the world, which I think is also equally unreasonable and inhuman. Um, and I don't necessarily even know what the right answer is. I certainly don't know what the right answer is. I don't even know if I think I know what the right answer is, but I feel like I can. The quality of the debate is not good. I think we live in this highly polarized, soundbitey world where people in their social media bubbles get really isolated. You see it in U.S. politics right now, pretty tragically, which I obviously watch very closely. And I think you see the same thing in COVID. And if when there's certain examples of academics that have taken positions that maybe divergent from the mainstream, but they are not irresponsible positions. They are well reasoned positions that may deviate from what others think, but they get destroyed in social media as murderers. That's been very depressing to watch.
Yeah, I feel like there is. I don't know if it's social media. I don't know if it's the way that media is currently, with all the clickbait headlines and the need to sensationalize and scare people. But we are the nuance has kind of been cut out of all the conversation, and it's all very binary. It's all very black and white, and it doesn't matter what the topic is. It could be social issues, could be COVID, could be anything. It's either you're in this camp or that camp, and there's no, and the middle has kind of been muddied up. Like there's just not a lot of conversation happening on any topic really. It's just like you have to pick a camp. It's full on tribalism right now,
Yeah,
especially here in the US.
and the camps are extreme. Like I had a friend come to visit. I did a Zoom call with him, but he happened to be in Berlin, and he had arrived from California,
Yeah,
and he's a wonderful guy. He's a super liberal person, and he came to Berlin, which is also like a liberal city.
yeah,
And he said, "Oh, it's so nice to me in Berlin because people are so much more relaxed about masks. If I walk around outside and he's like, and I wear a mask. He's like, he's not against masks. He's like, I wear masks. I totally buy into this, but like, I get yelled at in California if I don't have my mask on exactly right or at the right time, or
yeah.
or I stand too close to someone, I get yelled at like viciously. And in Berlin, people are a bit more relaxed about this. And it's such a pleasure to be around like a more normal, And I was like, wow, that sounds like really polarized. And I think you're right. And if you come from sadly, if you come from a red state, it's the opposite.
Hmm.
You put on a mask, you get criticized and bullied and whatever. So it's sad. I don't have anything wise to say about it, but
No. Well, yeah, I'll say the last thing on this on my end, but I do feel like it's almost not. It almost doesn't matter what the side. It's not like one side is really advocating and is really passionate about it. It's almost like, wait, what does the other side think? Oh no, that I have to think the opposite of what they think, and I have to show you that I'm all in on this. Like the other day, I was walking, and everywhere I go, I put my mask on. I'm respectful. I always put my mask on indoors, but I didn't have my mask on outdoors because I was walking my dog. I didn't really feel like it. And this woman kind of runs towards me, and she's like shaking her head and like she's making a point that she's running around me. I was like, dude, I don't care. your head shaking is really not relevant to me. But she really wanted to make a point to show how, the virtue signaling, how virtuous she was. So there is a lot of that happening right now. And just for example, when I was up in Connecticut, no one wears masks, at least like outdoors, no one wears masks. And their numbers are fine and their businesses are running. So there's not one way of doing things, but when you're stuck in at least like in the bubble of New York or maybe California as well, you think this is the way it has to be done, and it's not the truth. Anyway, let's go back a little bit. Maybe give a little bit of background about yourself, where you grew up, how you became a VC, how you went into Angular Ventures. Just a little bit of background.
sure. I feel like maybe we need to take the COVID piece and cut it out or put it at the end because no one,
Yeah.
no one is going to want to listen to that. Like nobody.
COVID rant and then the introduction.
Exactly. No one is going to want to listen to the COVID thing, especially since we live in an era where every single Zoom call starts with, "Hey, are you okay? What's going on with COVID?"
Yeah.
So
Still there?
yeah, exactly. So consider it. Put it at the end, an appendix. People want to hear random thoughts on COVID.
I'll edit the whole thing out.
Look, I think my background. I grew up in Boston in the U.S. Mom's Israeli, dad's American. Moved to Israel after business school and a brief stint on Wall Street prior to business school. That was 2005 when I actually moved. Worked for two different VCs in Israel. Kind of cut my teeth as a young VC for a firm called Genesis and a firm called Gemini. Was fortunate to be the guy who sort of encouraged those two firms and drove those two firms to make two investments, one in each case, that both turned into unicorns. So out of a pool of 8 investments, all done at very low valuations, very early stage, we ended up with 2 of them becoming, in one case, a NASDAQ IPO, a company called JFrog, and another one, a company worth well over $1 billion, doing well over $100 million in sales, called Sisense. And then that led me to get recruited by Index Ventures to join them in London to help them run their European and Israeli seed investment operation in 2012. And really had no desire to live in London or in Europe. Love Israel, love living there, but was attracted to the idea of new geography, new challenges. I was single at the time. Index is a great global firm, and pretty quickly realized that that wasn't going to be a long-term home for me as a firm. But at the same time, there were really interesting things happening in entrepreneurship in Europe, and that the skill set that I developed in Israel was really valuable and really specific and really interesting. That there were a lot of similarities and commonalities between the best European companies and the best Israeli companies, and that maybe it made sense to think about investing on that basis, as opposed to saying, well, oh, I'm an Israeli VC, I do Israel. I'm a French VC, I do France. I'm a Nordic VC, I do the Nordics. I'm a Southern Northwest Rhine-Westphalia. No. Like I think European venture, certainly when I arrived, was hyper fragmented, driven by a lot of government money that had like an agenda. And so if you wanted to raise a VC fund in Europe, you either needed to have government money that would put strings on you, or a corporate backer that had other corporate objectives. And there were very few people doing early stage thematic investing driven by purely commercial considerations. And so that's what Angular Ventures set out to do. Raising that fund took me, depending on how you count it, between 3 and 5 years of no income and no sign of light at the end of the tunnel. And it was, I think entrepreneurs really groan when VCs say, "Oh, I'm a founder because I founded a firm," and I totally get that. I agree with them. I think VC is a very different ballgame, and in many ways, it is ultimately easier and less stressful, I think, than being a founder of a single company. Plus, as a VC, you have initially zero and ultimately very few employees, so you don't feel like you're responsible for as many careers and livelihoods as I think when you're a startup with a lot of employees. I think that weighs on a lot of founders. So it is easier. But there was, for me at least, some entrepreneurial journey of coming up with a thesis, trying to convince investors, building the business, building the brand, trying to figure that out. Ultimately, it took, I think, 3-4 years to get to the first close, which was 11 million. The final close was about a year later, was 40 million, just over 40. We're very lucky with the LPs that we have. I think I have an LP base that's outstanding, and I could never have imagined such a good LP base when I set out to do this. So we're very, very lucky on that front. We're lucky with the investments that we have. I've got 2 fantastic teammates. So it's an exciting time.
Yeah, and you guys are a deep tech fund, correct?
Yeah, I sort of define it as enterprise and deep tech, which is kind of a mouthful, but I think it's accurate. We don't do any consumer, we don't do any pharma, medical devices, therapeutics, diagnostics, but we will look at anything that is either selling to a business or leveraging deep technology to sell to a business. And when I talk about this, I got a whole blog post on this, but the gist of it is that I think those 2 words kind of mean 2 things that are semi-orthogonal. Enterprise sort of means there's a certain way of building a business when you are selling to a business buyer who is deciding on your product or service as part of their job, as opposed to if you're Peloton, you're selling to a consumer as part of their enjoyment of life, their consumption. A business user makes decisions often organizationally, often much more rationally, sometimes less rationally, but often much more. At least they think there's a rational process. And then deep tech sort of implies that we tend to look for businesses or get extra excited about businesses that have some deep technical barrier to entry. Those two circles in the Venn diagram usually overlap, but sometimes they don't. So we have some companies that are deep tech and not really an enterprise sales process in the traditional sense. And we have some companies that are very much an enterprise sales process, but it's kind of hard to make the case that they're doing something that is truly deep tech, groundbreaking technology. It's just a really well thought out product that can be very difficult and defensible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're pushing some technical envelope.
I see. Maybe 3 years ago, I went to a really big tech conference here in New York City, and I want to say about 90% of the companies there that were presenting and had booths were SaaS companies. And at the time, I remember I was kind of like blown away. But do you maybe have an insight why there has been such an explosion of SaaS companies in the past, I don't know, 5 years or maybe more?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time to reflect on SaaS. Because SaaS means a lot of different things to different people. I would probably argue that virtually 100% of the companies that I've invested in my entire career, going back to 2007, were SaaS. So Uh, and now SaaS initially meant a kind of an architecture. It was software, but it wasn't software that you installed. It was software that was running on someone else's server, and you were using it and paying and using it as a service, meaning it was being delivered to you as a service. And I think people now in 2020 forget that initially software was delivered as a collection of bytes on a disk or a CD that you could actually walk into a customer's office and give it to them. That's how you sold software. Like, hey, here's the CD with the software on it. Let's install it, right? And so SaaS initially meant, no, we're not doing that. We're delivering this over the cloud. It very quickly, immediately became coupled with SaaS as a business model, which sort of meant you are paying a recurring fee for a service, as opposed to buying a license that's a perpetual license or an annual license. And rather than paying, $100 license and $20 maintenance, let's say for a 5-year deal, you just pay $25 a year, for subscription, which is lower cost of ownership. It's more flexible. Customers like it because they can scale up and down. They can shut it off. They can turn it on. It's a lot easier. And there's this perception, it's not perception. There's this understanding that you're always getting the latest version of whatever it is that you bought, as opposed to having to get the new CD with a new version of Windows. You now get Windows, or Office 365, and you're always getting the updates, and you're just subscribing to that as a service. And I think that as software has taken over the world, a lot of things have become SaaS. So you could go as far as to say, well, maybe Spotify is a SaaS, and maybe Peloton itself it's hardware, but it's also kind of a SaaS because you're paying for a service. And okay, maybe you're actually paying for classes, but there's a lot of software there. It's being delivered from the cloud, and yeah, there's an instructor, and that's a real person. But if it was an avatar, you would still pay for it, and it would be purely SaaS. So I think. It's sort of taken over the business world. Now, why is it taken over the business world? Because the economics of this are really, really wonderful. From a business's point of view, there's the recurring revenue model that comes from subscription revenue, and that kind of model is incredibly appealing because it's predictable, and because people can just run the calculation, saying, "Hey, I know that the average life of an account is this much, and I know it costs me this much to get them, and I know I'm going to make this much money from them over time, and so I can understand my growth, and understand the value of my company pretty well, and understand how that's going to grow fairly easily, and it becomes very cumulative or very accretive because every time you add a customer, in theory, you're adding them as a subscriber forever, and the onboarding, the activation energy required for a customer to join is usually pretty low, relative to the traditional software license world. And then I think the last aspect of SaaS was that, and I think this has largely gone away by now, but I think SaaS for a time was almost like a religion or a cult, where like there were certain metrics and certain numbers that people felt if like CAC to LTV ratio is above a certain number, below a certain number, I'm a good company. If it's above that number, I'm a bad company. And there was a lot of sort of fetishization of certain elements of the SaaS model. So the best example was LTV, lifetime value of a customer. There was a lot of sort of fairly thoughtless analysis that people were doing of saying, hey, if you pay me, my churn is 0 because I have 10 customers and none of them are left. And so therefore my LTV is infinite, or some really high number that, like there was a lot of, a lot of abuse of some of these simplistic metrics, because there was this tremendous buy-in to this idea that because all SaaS companies, even though they might have been doing vastly different things, were operating with the same general physics, you could easily compare a company selling oil and gas optimization software and a company selling medical technology and a company selling, consumer, workout analytics or something, right? And all of those businesses were the same. They all had a CAC, they all had an LTV, they all had a ARR, and it allowed a lot of investors and I think a lot of founders to ignore the unique parts of their business, the parts that were really driving the value, and really determining the physics, and just focus on some headline numbers. I think that's largely gone away by now, but there was several years of obsession with some of these numbers.
Oh, interesting. Also, like if you look at, just as if you create a product, right? There's so much that goes into creating a product. The shipping or the creating, the returns that you get sometime, there's just so much involved. And when it's all virtual, when the only thing you essentially have to pay is for human capital, it's just such a better business model than what we were creating before. And I actually remember those prehistoric days of the discs, where you would get discs all the time. It almost like I think I haven't thought of that in a couple of years until you just said it. It just seems like something prehistoric. That's really funny.
Yeah, and the
Um,
funny part is there are still industries like we have. I work with a number of companies that are selling to heavy industry, oil and gas, you know, vehicle fleet management, stuff like that. And they're just starting to think about the SaaS adoption curve. And founders show up and say, hey, I'd like to sell you this great model where it's a SaaS subscription fee and it's easy to do and it's easy to pay and you can turn off anytime you want. And some of them, honest to goodness, say like, hey, we'd rather pay you $1 million up front because that's how we think about this. Like we have a budget for that. We don't really want to pay you $200K a year for 5 years. We want to pay you $5 million now and capitalize it because that's how our accounting works and that's how we think about things. And it can be a struggle because VCs then look at that and say, oh, well, we don't like, you sold $1 million of software, but it was license revenue. And the founders are like, it's license revenue, but it doesn't matter. They're going to renew, and it's not actually a license sale. It's actually a SaaS. It's being delivered as a SaaS. It's not. There's no install cost. But there are still industries that want the disc,
yeah,
and we're still educating them.
they're still catching up. They'll get there. Was 2020 busier than what you would think? I think in the beginning of the year, everyone thought it's doomsday, apocalyptic. Everything is about to go to hell. And I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just from being on Twitter, probably more than I should, and following a lot of VC and entrepreneurs, it seems like it was a busier year than usual, or at least more than what was expected.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we keep a very steady pace. So, we invest um, between 4 to 6 investments a year. This year we did 6. Very, very steady. So no big difference in the way we ended up acting. But I think, but we're like that. I think most of my VC colleagues have reported, and I've seen in our deal flow. Our deal flow was insane. Now I don't know if it's because we're still a new firm and our deal flow is growing all the time. But fourth quarter 2020 was a record quarter. Third quarter 2020 was a record quarter. And I think first quarter 2020 was a record quarter, despite March being the beginning of COVID. Second quarter was slow, and I think we also, I was one of the people that was very publicly saying, I think founders need to approach this period cautiously. But I think when the shape of the pandemic began to become clear, and in the grand scheme of pathogens, this virus, while deadly and dangerous and important to fight it and the whole thing, it's not going to kill everybody, and it's not going to kill most people. And
It's
I
not
think
Ebola.
it's not exactly. It's not. It's a manage. At the end of the day, it's going to be manageable. It may take some time, significant cost, significant death, significant economic harm, significant psychological harm, but it will be something that the world gets through. And I also think for the first time in history, we had the technology to deal with it. We had mRNA and rapid vaccines and genetic sequencing and all the stuff that we needed to deal with it medically pretty quickly. I think people were astounded that the vaccines happened as fast as they did. And I think we also had Zoom. And so from a business perspective, there were the tools. The tools were there. And the cloud was there, and the cloud scaled, and people's networks scaled, and people could do this. And I think for a lot of startups, there was absolutely a period, April, May, June, maybe, where founders and VCs were slow. Everything slowed down. I think VCs were nervous about investing, not having met people. We had actually invested in one company without having met them before, and it's one of our most successful companies. So we felt like we knew how to do this. And since I joined Index, so 2012, I have been looking at deals all over Europe and doing first and second and even third meetings remotely as a matter of course, because you don't sit in London and fly to Estonia every time there's a cool Estonian company. You don't even take the train to Edinburgh every time there's a cool Edinburgh company. And I actually realized at one point London is so big. Why should I waste 2 hours on the tube for a first meeting when I can meet someone over Zoom and then invest in the best companies to go to their office and the whole thing? So I think most European VCs and a lot of US VCs were getting really comfortable doing a lot of work remotely anyway. But I think still there was a reluctance. So that slowed things down. I think a lot of founders were less likely to jump ship and start a company when no one was clear on where this was going. And I think by July, when it seemed clear where it was headed, I think everyone sort of realized they needed to normalize, and they kept going. And So that's, we did definitely bounce back, and we're even, at a record level, and we're at a record in terms of deal flow. But if you look at like overall market statistics in Israel, in Europe, in the US, they're all at record levels. Deal volumes, deal sizes, the whole thing. Um, so the other thing that I think happened, so that's on like the deal flow side. On the startup side, it was really interesting to watch companies adjust to the new reality of selling. So if your sales process relied on self-service, online, over-the-top acquisition and sales, nothing really changed for you. If anything, you were just more focused. No one was traveling, no one was meeting, there was no water cooler at the office, people just doing their work and executing. And life became almost like a sort of a video game where like all we have is the virtual interface with stuff, and we're just playing that game for a few hours a day and see what we can achieve. But for a lot of companies where their sales process did rely on lead generation at conferences and flying to install things at customer sites, and meeting customers and looking them in the eye and convincing them that the product was going to be valuable and all of those things, that was a big shock for a lot of these companies to try to figure out, how do we sell, how do we build trust, how do we build relationships in a climate where we cannot meet people in person and we cannot fly. And I think it took people, amazingly, most of the companies in our portfolio didn't really see too much of an impact. They might have seen a month or two delay while they retooled, but I actually think it's been very positive for a lot of them, because Martin Casado is one of my favorite VCs, partner managers in Horowitz, has a YouTube clip called Growth Sales. And he basically is arguing that it used to be that startups thought about sales, and then once they figured sales out, they thought about growth. And sales means like sending a salesperson to sell. And then growth means, okay, how do we scale that activity and drive people through the funnel? And I think what Martin's arguing is that, and I think he's absolutely right, is that because of SaaS, because of the SaaSification of everything and the cloudification of everything, products are getting easier and easier for people to deploy. And everything is moving towards more and more of a self-service, easy install model, bottoms up, self-service, freemium, and then you send in the salesperson over the top to close the sale or to make the sale bigger. Usually it's not even to close the sale's already closed. They're just there to expand it. So from one team, let's serve the whole company, let's figure that out. Or let's start with small businesses or smaller businesses that we can sell to self-service. And then once we get some users at a big company, say, oh no, it's a big company, let's send a salesperson in. And I think that's been a very positive, and people have been talking about this for a long time, product-led sales, sales growth, different phrases they use. Growth sales. I think what COVID did was it forced companies to adopt those methodologies, whether or not they wanted to. And I think for companies that understood that, it actually was a tremendous accelerant. There was a cliche, and unfortunately it's true. I think that COVID has pushed everything 5 years into the future.
Yeah.
I'm now working out with a personal trainer over Zoom, which is bizarre, but it works. And he's great. And like, I love it. And so maybe that is the future. Maybe I'm not going to go back to the gym. I don't know. But what it did to startups was it pushed them 5 years into the future and how they think about sales mechanics. And for companies that have embraced that, it's actually been crazy positive. It's very weird to see, but it's been crazy positive.
Zoom is one of the most interesting things, and something I actually wanted to ask you about. It's almost like it's like a boxer that trains his whole life, and then he gets to championship situation and he loses the fight. Like he's trained his whole life for this moment, 12, 15, 20 years, and he's got a bout against a champion and he loses in the first round. And I feel like Skype and Zoom is a similar situation, whereas Skype has been around for so long and almost this was their moment to shine, right? Like 2020, everyone's going to be using Skype, and literally no one used Skype. Everyone moved to Zoom, and within a year, it just became one of the most biggest and most popular companies. How does and I actually saw that you talked about another company called Slido, which I just found out. I think it was you were talking about it. I believe it was you.
Don't think so.
Slide or Slido, which is a small competitor that's on the rise. Maybe I saw it somewhere else. But regardless, like how did they become such a massive company when there was another company all these years? And yeah,
I mean, I think there's better people to ask than me. I don't know the inside story of Zoom. I think a lot of people have written about it. I think from my perspective, Zoom is a fascinating example because it wasn't just Skype; it was WebEx and a million other companies that were trying to do this. Um, I think Zoom understood. It's a great example of product, right? Of the triumph of product. And I think it's also a great example of engineering, where Zoom nailed, for example, Angular. We started off using Google Hangouts because it was easy, right? And it wasn't good. The video wasn't good enough. And so everyone was saying you should switch to Zoom. So we switched to Zoom and the video was perfect. They did a lot of work on the back end that nobody knows about, nobody cares about. Like no one, people care about the result, but they don't understand or know about all the optimizations that go into the back end of Zoom. But it just works. And they made some decisions early in the life of the company to really invest in that when it really mattered and when that was a differentiator. There is sometimes in the adoption curve of a new technology, there is a point when the technology itself, the ability to do a video call, is so amazing. You want to see your grandmother in South Africa? I have a video call, amazing, and you don't care how good the video call is. But then there's another point when like someone can say, hey, you know what? My video call is way better than your video call. And sometimes that's something you can explain, and sometimes like, no, just try it. And I think Zoom managed to, at a time in history and a time in technology adoption when that was, we're not on Zoom now, and the video is amazing when I'm talking to you, right? It's great, but it's too late, right? Zoom at exactly at the right time was like, we've got video that's amazing, and anyone who tried it stayed. That's the first thing that they did. They invested in the engineering to make that really fly. The second thing they did that I'm aware of that I think was really, really important is they made it really, really easy to integrate Zoom with the rest of your life, with your calendar, with your scheduling, with your email, with the links. They solved just enough of the security and meeting management and webinar issues that people had, that they made it just easy enough to use that it was kind of really, they greased the wheels of adoption. And maybe the third thing that Zoom benefited from is it's inherently viral. You're using it in order to communicate with another person who may not have been a Zoom user until you invited that person. And then they saw Zoom and they saw that it was better. So in inherently viral situations, a superior experience can really drive adoption in a super meaningful way. And I think Zoom figured that out.
yeah. And I mean, to your point, I think if it wasn't for COVID, I don't know if they would have blown up as much, or maybe it would have taken them 5 years or so. But it was just, it's bad to say it, but it was lucky for them that COVID came around this year and they just blew up all over the world in a massive way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, why do you think? Because I know like you said earlier, from Israel and invest in Israeli companies. Why do you think Israel has become such a juggernaut for startups? It's dubbed the startup nation. I think it has more VC investment and more startups and exits per capita than any other country. Why did this little half a desert country in the Middle East become such a huge player in this game?
Um, it's a great question. I don't think that there's a conclusive answer to that.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's a combination of factors. I think there's obviously so there's a few factors. The two that are most commonly cited are the army and culture. right? And I think there's others. I think the Army is important. I think and you see that in the US as well, with military veterans often being very good founders. They're pretty good with dealing with uncertainty. They're pretty good with discipline. They're pretty good with team leading and team building and determining objectives, and then a lot of things that are very important for early stage startup founders. The other way that the military, particularly in Israel, I think helps is that Israel has a very technically oriented military infrastructure, very advanced intelligence services, very advanced technology, because they have to have a technological and intelligence advantage over adversaries that have huge advantages in terms of numbers and funding, at least historically. And I think they also are very good at identifying technical talent and putting them in technical roles. And the other thing is that they're doing that when people are 18. They're not doing it when people are 22.
Yeah.
And so the effect of that is that you're basically taking super talented, already very technical people, and before they do their first degree, in many cases, you're putting them in a real world operational setting where they're looking at huge problems that scale at the cutting edge of technology. So you're 20 years old and you're involved in analyzing all the phone calls in Syria. You're 20 years old and you're involved in putting some or defending against, or either defending against or implementing some kind of crazy cyber attack,
Yeah.
right? And then what happens is, so people are seeing at an early stage in their career, they're seeing stuff being done at a very advanced level that's mission critical. They have responsibility for it, operational responsibility for it. And then they get out of the Army and then they start their career in their first degree in computer science. So by the time they start their official training in computer science or physics or whatever it is, they've already experienced real world issues at a super high level. And I think it puts their academic studies and their business operations or their business efforts, their early business efforts, into context that undergraduates in the Western world don't have. So they're much more keyed up on what real world issues look like at the cutting edge than a lot of others. That's the military aspect of it. I think the culture aspect of it is just something that I think there are some cultures that are better at it than others, or more where it's more encouraged. And I think Israel is a culture like that. And I think there's a few other factors as well. I think one factor that's underappreciated is that in the 80s, you could not get rich in Israel. The country's way too small. So you could be the best investment banker in the whole country, and you are not going to ever make it. Same thing for lawyers, same thing for real estate, whatever. So the only way that you could make money really was to do something global and significant. And I think that drove a lot of talented people into export and into technology, because that was something that could be easily exported. Another one was the arms embargo of the 70s. After the 667 war, the Arab world, and a lot of Europe put an arms embargo on Israel and forced them to source a lot of advanced military technology internally. So they had to build one of the only, semiconductor hubs outside the U.S. and Russia, was in Israel, because the Americans didn't start selling them arms until the 70s, and the Europeans stopped selling them arms in the 60s, and it was a problem. And the other thing that happened, which I think is underappreciated, is the massive influx of Soviet immigrants starting in the 70s and then massively accelerating in the late 80s and early 90s. But those immigrants from the former Soviet Union were arriving in Israel in the 70s, right into that growth of the early Israeli electronics and semiconductor industry. And they came with exactly the right skill sets. They had learned math and physics and science and electrical engineering at the highest possible level, because the Soviet system was super good at that stuff. And they came to Israel and they spoke no Hebrew and they spoke no English, and they couldn't get a job, and they were really low cost, phenomenally talented labor for the early generations of the Israeli semiconductor industry. And I think that's a really underappreciated advantage that Israel had in the 70s and 80s, of this just incredibly talented workforce, trained in classically trained basic STEM stuff.
Yeah. I also think there's this is a word that just is literally no translation, but there's a word in Hebrew called kombina, and you know it, but it's essentially something between hustling and finding loopholes. And there's a whole country that a lot of times is thinking, how do you do combinot? And there's this out of the box thinking, I think personally at least,
100%.
of a lot of people like, wait, okay, so this is the thing, but let me see how I can look around it and maybe find another solution. And while like we laugh at it back home, I think there is an advantage to that out of the box thinking.
Yeah, 100%. I think those are the sort of the cultural factors. Chutzpah is another one that people talk
Yeah.
about. And I think, look, I think Israel itself, it's a problem-solving culture. I mean, it was invented to solve a problem. I mean, that's a whole political conversation. But you had to be somewhat insane to move to Israel, or you had to have your back against the wall. And I think those are pretty good drivers of innovation. And it's a culture that accepts that and respects it, and that's being applied in tech now. The other thing I think is underappreciated is that the timing was really good, right? So Israel needed to build an internal electronics industry not in 2020, in 1970, which was exactly the right time. That's when it started. So they were not playing catch up, really. They were building a local electronics and Comtech semis and silicon, all that stuff. Like there's a reason why the 486 chip was developed in Israel. There's a reason why the Discon key was invented in Israel. There's a reason why Sisense and Firebolt were invested in Israel, because all of those waves of technology, we don't have time for it now, but they all feed off each other, and they all started with communications, right? Why was Israel building those communication chips? Because it wanted to intercept enemy communications. What were they going to do with that? They were going to store it in a database. They were going to do data analytics on it. They were going to, they were solving massive scale data problems and communications problems and semiconductor problems, at the right times and in sequence. And that was throwing off all of this wonderful talent that could then take those military technologies and apply them to civilian needs. And I think that's, the timing was perfect.
Where do you see the next powerhouse coming from? What are some up and coming nations that you think will be, maybe the next Israel or the next whatever is, Silicon Valley, maybe in Africa or Asia?
Yeah. That's right. Good place to close. I think the answer is, I don't know if you like this answer, but the philosophy of Angular Ventures and my philosophy is that this stuff can come from anywhere.
Okay.
The philosophy that I have is that being Israeli does not make a company good. Being French or Estonian does not make a company good. I think for many years, my colleagues in Israel and my colleagues in Europe were spending a lot of mental energy trying to identify clusters and patterns and say, oh, well, the UK has Cambridge and they're really good at artificial intelligence. And so the UK is going to be an AI powerhouse. Well, okay, maybe you can make that case, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be a really good AI company coming out of Scotland or coming out of Belgium. So I think this technology is proliferating, entrepreneurship is proliferating, the startup skill set is proliferating, the capital to back these things is starting to proliferate as well. So you really can build these things anywhere, and not to mention that even before COVID, we were moving towards a more distributed world. That was happening full on. So I think you know, I really struggle to analyze this geographically. We collect all the data in our deal flow. We don't have any geographic targets as a fund. I don't think I ever say, okay, I'm going to fly to Estonia every 2 weeks because I really believe in the Estonian market, although the Estonian market is arguably maybe per capita more unicorns than Israel. But there are countries, I think the one thing I can say is that the smaller the country, typically, the more interesting some of the companies become, because like Israel, they have to go global to be interesting, to be valuable. Whereas the UK, France, Germany are so large that they often generate companies that are serving a local market really effectively and don't have the need or the drive or the ambition to go and sell into the global market, which they scale quickly initially, and then they can sometimes peter out when they meet the real market. So we try very hard to filter for companies that are very clearly selling internationally from day one, and going up against all of their competitive set. So that's one thing that I've noticed. Like if you look at the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, they have been phenomenal generators of startups. But it's everywhere. I mean, there's an amazing venture fund called Marathon, which is based in Greece and only invests in Greek founders, and they've got some amazing companies in there. Their track record is outstanding. So there's the same things happening in Turkey, the same things happening in Italy. So it's really internationalizing and democratizing in a very exciting way.
Gil, I know you got to go. I won't hold you up. Thank
you
you
so
for your
much.
time today.
Thank you so much, Roy. Oi.
And yeah, where can people find you on the internet? Where are the best places?
Gil at angularventures.com, G Dibner on Twitter, and our website, angularventures.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter, which we occasionally even put out.
And he's got really great articles too on Medium. I read the majority of them, and really insightful. So thanks again, man. And maybe we'll do it again later in the year. There's a lot of questions I wanted to ask. And again, thanks for your time, man.
Good stuff. Thank you. Bye-bye.